You're in ancient Egypt. Pharaohs are being buried in massive pyramids, temples are covered in gold. The civilization is building monuments that will last thousands of years. Priests are performing elaborate rituals, scribes are recording everything in hieroglyphs. And you're being paid to cry at a stranger's funeral. Not just cry, scream, wail, tear your clothes, throw dirt on yourself, scratch your face until it bleeds, pull out your hair, collapse on the ground in apparent grief. You're a professional mourner. Your job is to show up at funerals, put on the most dramatic display of sorrow humanly possible for people you've never met, people whose names you don't even know. Welcome to one of ancient Egypt's strangest professions, and trust me, this job was way more complicated and disturbing than just faking some tears. Ancient Egyptians took death seriously. They believed your journey to the afterlife depended on proper burial rituals. Everything had to be done correctly, or your soul was screwed for eternity. Part of those rituals involved mourning, lots of mourning. The more grief displayed at your funeral, the better your chances in the afterlife. Loud wailing, visible distress, dramatic gestures of sorrow, all of it was supposed to help the deceased transition to the next world. But here's the problem. Not everyone had enough family and friends to create the level of mourning required for a proper funeral. Maybe you're wealthy, but didn't have any relatives. Maybe your family was small. Maybe you'd outlived most of your friends. Maybe you were just an unpopular person who nobody really liked. Either way, if your funeral was quiet and dignified with just a handful of people standing around looking sad, well, that wasn't good enough. Egyptian funerals needed drama. They needed noise. They needed visible, overwhelming grief. So families hired professional mourners. Women, almost always women, would show up and provide the theatrical display of sorrow that the funeral required. The wealthier you were, the more mourners your family could afford to hire. Some funerals had dozens of professional mourners all performing grief simultaneously. It was a status symbol. Look at how many people are devastated by this death. Oh, look how important this person was. Except most of these devastated people had never met the deceased and were just doing their job. And now you might be thinking, okay, that's weird, but at least it's just some acting and crying, right? I mean, how bad could it be? Oh, well, you've no idea what this job actually involved, because Egyptian mourning wasn't just tears and sadness. It was violent, physically demanding, and legitimately dangerous. You're a professional mourner. You've been hired for a funeral happening tomorrow. Well, let me walk you through what you're expected to do. You show up wearing simple white clothing that you're about to destroy. The funeral procession begins. The body is being transported to the tomb. Family members are walking alongside, priests are chanting, and you begin performing. You start wailing, not crying, wailing. Loud, high-pitched screaming that can be heard from far away. You're shrieking the name of the deceased. You're calling out to the gods. You're making as much noise as physically possible. And while you're wailing, you're also moving, swaying, throwing your arms in the air, clutching your head. The performance has to be physical and visible from a distance. Then you start tearing up your clothes. You grab your linen dress and rip it, shred it. By the end of the funeral, you'll be in tatters. You throw dust and dirt on yourself. You're coating your hair, your face, your torn clothing in dirt. You're supposed to look completely disheveled and overcome with grief. Now comes the really intense part. You scratch your face hard. You drag your nails down your cheeks until you draw blood. You're supposed to show visible injury from your grief. Scratch marks, bleeding, bruising. The more dramatic, the better. People need to get their money's worth after all. You pull your hair, not just tug on it, you actually pull clumps of your hair out of your head. You hold up the hair, show it to everyone, then throw it on the ground or toward the coffin as an offering of grief. You beat your chest over and over, hard enough to bruise, hard enough to hurt. You might throw yourself on the ground, roll in the dirt, pound the earth with your fists. All of this while maintaining constant loud wailing and crying. And you do this for hours. Egyptian funerals weren't quick. The procession to the tomb could take hours. Then there were rituals at the tomb entrance, more ceremonies, more opportunities for you to perform your grief. By the end, you're exhausted. Your voice is raw from screaming. Your face is bleeding. Your scalp hurts from pulling out hair. You're covered in dirt and sweat. Your clothes are destroyed. You're bruised and sore. And then you collect your payment and go home to recover before the next funeral. But wait, you're probably wondering how often you had to do this. Was it occasional work, like once a month? Or was this a regular job? Well, the answer is going to surprise you, because professional mourning wasn't some rare gig, it was steady work. And that created problems you probably haven't thought about yet. Professional mourning wasn't a side job for many women, this was their primary income. Egypt had a lot of deaths, disease, accidents, old age, childbirth complications. People died regularly, and wealthy families held elaborate funerals frequently. If you're an established professional mourner with a good reputation, you might work several funerals per week, sometimes multiple in one day, if the timing worked out. So, you're constantly performing grief, constantly screaming and crying and injuring yourself. Your body never fully recovers because you're doing it again in a few days. Your face has permanent scars from repeated scratching. Your scalp has thin patches where you've pulled out hair so many times it doesn't grow back properly. Your chest is always bruised, your voice is perpetually hoarse. You're in chronic pain. Your throat hurts, your scalp aches, your body is sore. But you can't stop because this is how you make money. And the physical toll is only part of it. There's also the psychological weight of performing extreme emotion repeatedly for people you don't know. You're screaming in grief multiple times per week. You're acting out the worst moments of human emotion over and over. Even though you're faking it, even though you didn't know these people, your brain and body are still experiencing the physical stress of extreme grief performance. Egyptian society had complicated views about professional mourners. On one hand, you were performing necessary religious functions. You were helping the deceased reach the afterlife. On the other hand, you were basically a grief prostitute. You were selling emotional performance. You were faking one of the most sacred human experiences for money. Your social life was weird. Did people want to be around you when your job was crying at strangers' funerals? Did men want to marry professional mourners? Well, the answer was probably no. Professional mourning was work that poor women did because they had limited other options. It paid decently. It didn't require special education or training. You just had to be willing to injure yourself repeatedly and scream until your voice gave out. Now, here's something that's going to make this even stranger. Because professional mourning wasn't just about the funeral itself. There were other duties that came with the job, and some of them were genuinely disturbing. As a professional mourner, you weren't just hired for the funeral day. Wealthy families sometimes hired mourners for extended periods. Some mourners were expected to visit the tomb regularly after the burial and perform grief there. You'd go to the tomb entrance, wail and cry, making offerings, acting out your sorrow for any passers-by to witness. So you might have a contract where you visit a tomb once a week or once a month for a year after the burial. Each visit requires you to perform the same intense grief display. Some professional mourners specialized in particular types of deaths. Child deaths required different mourning than elderly deaths. Sudden, tragic deaths needed more intense performance than expected deaths from old age. If you were known for particularly good performance at children's funerals, you'd get hired specifically for those, which meant repeatedly acting out the grief of losing a child you never met, over and over. And then there were the funeral feasts. After the burial, wealthy families held feasts. As a professional mourner, you were sometimes expected to continue your performance during the feast. So you're sitting there with food in front of you, still crying, still looking devastated while everyone else is eating and socializing. You're supposed to be too overcome with grief to eat, even though you're exhausted and starving from hours of performance. Some families expected mourners to fast during the mourning period. No eating from the start of the funeral until after the tomb was sealed. That could be a full day or more of physical exertion with no food. And all of this raises an important question. Who actually became professional mourners? What kind of women ended up in this profession? Because the answer tells you a lot about ancient Egyptian society. Professional mourners were almost exclusively women. Men didn't do this work. It was considered a female role, tied to women's traditional association with emotional expression. Most professional mourners were poor, women with no other viable income options, widows who had no family support, divorced women who couldn't remarry, women from the lowest social classes who needed work and had no skills or education. Young women usually didn't become professional mourners unless they were desperate. The job was physically demanding and left visible scars. It wasn't something you did if you hoped to marry well. Older women past childbearing age, women who'd already raised families and were now supporting themselves, these were common professional mourners. Some professional mourners came from families where this was traditional work. Your mother was a mourner, your grandmother was a mourner, so you became a mourner. The training was informal. An experienced mourner would teach you the proper gestures, the traditional songs, how to injure yourself effectively without causing permanent damage, how to maintain your performance for hours. The best professional mourners became almost celebrities in the community. Everyone knew who they were. When you showed up at a funeral, people knew it would be a good show. But even the most successful professional mourners were still social outsiders. Your job was grief. You were constantly associated with death and loss. People didn't want that energy in their regular lives. And the work never really ended, because in ancient Egypt, death was constant and funerals never stopped happening. Which brings us to maybe the darkest part of this whole thing. What this job did to you over years and decades, and trust me, the long-term consequences were brutal. Imagine doing this work for 20 years, your entire adult life. Your body is wrecked. The repeated self-injury has left permanent scars. Your face has deep scratches that never fully healed. Your scalp has bald patches. Your chest is covered in old bruises that never quite fade. Your voice is damaged. Years of screaming has destroyed your vocal cords. You sound hoarse all the time. You're desensitized to death. You've performed grief at so many funerals that real death doesn't affect you anymore. When someone you know actually dies, someone you actually cared about, you might not be able to feel genuine grief. You've faked it so many times that you've lost access to the real emotion. And as you age and your body can't handle the physical demands anymore, what then? Will you end up begging or depending on charity or dying alone and poor after spending your entire life helping wealthy people have impressive funerals? The irony is brutal. You've performed at hundreds of elaborate funerals for people who could afford professional mourners. When you die, your funeral probably has nobody. No mourners, professional or otherwise. Just a quick, cheap burial that nobody notices. So why did this job exist for so long? Because I haven't told you the craziest part yet. And this is what really shows you how deeply embedded this profession was in Egyptian culture. Professional mourning in Egypt lasted for thousands of years, from the Old Kingdom through to the New Kingdom and beyond, generation after generation of women crying at strangers' funerals. Why? Because Egyptian beliefs about death never fundamentally changed. They always believed that proper mourning helped the deceased reach the afterlife. They always valued elaborate funeral displays. And there was always a supply of poor women who needed work. Some pharaohs' funerals had hundreds of professional mourners. Imagine hundreds of women all screaming and wailing and injuring themselves simultaneously. The noise must have been overwhelming. Common people couldn't afford that many mourners, but even modest funerals tried to hire at least a few. The entire Egyptian economy had a segment dedicated to professional grief. It was normal, expected, an accepted part of how death was handled. And nobody seemed to think it was strange that wealthy people paid poor women to injure themselves while crying about strangers. Being a professional mourner in ancient Egypt meant spending your life performing extreme grief for money. You injured yourself repeatedly. You screamed until your voice was destroyed. You tore your hair out and scratched your face until it bled. You did this multiple times per week for people you've never met. You were essential to Egyptian funeral rituals, but socially marginalized. You were necessary, but not respected. You provided a service that everyone used, but nobody wanted to think about. You made just enough money to survive, but never enough to escape the profession. Your body was permanently damaged from years of self-injury. And when you died, you probably got the kind of quiet, unmourned funeral that your entire career was dedicated to preventing for others. Your pain was part of the show. Your injuries proved the grief was real. You your destroyed voice and scarred face were evidence that proper mourning had occurred. You spent your whole life crying for people who never would have cried for you. Would you have survived as a professional mourner in ancient Egypt?